Hello. So, this lecture is an introduction into Israelite prophecy within the broader historical and social context of the ancient Near East. The prophets did play a very important role in Israelite society, and within the Bible, we have preserved for us a number of stories of prophets, such as Nathan and Elijah. And the Bible also contains 15 books that are named after individual prophets, such as Isaiah, Amos, Zephaniah, or Jeremiah. And the prophets were not unique to Israel. They were well known from a number of ancient Near Eastern cultures. Notable finds, discoveries of prophetic texts have been found at the ancient cities of Mari. Those are dated to the second millennium, and then also some texts that are found at Nineveh. Now, within the course information and texts and links, you will find some examples of prophetic texts, which I would like you to take the time to read through some of those examples. They're not long, but just to get a feel for what prophecy looked like within the broader ancient Near Eastern context. There's no substitute for looking at the primary source literature on that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about divination in the ancient Near East. The relationship between Israelite prophets and the practice of divination is sometimes misunderstood, although I think scholarship is quickly rectifying that situation. Part of the reason for this misunderstanding is because you have texts in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy which give clear prohibitions against the practice of divination. Leviticus 19:26, you shall not practice divination. Is pretty clear right there. And then Deuteronomy 18, there shall not be found among you one who uses divination, a soothsayer, one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer. But when we begin to look a little more closely, we see that these prohibitions seem to only apply to certain forms of divination. So with that, we need to get a sense of what divination is. So the basic definition of divination, what it is that we're talking about. This is the art or practice of discerning the divine will or intentions towards humans through supernatural means. Okay, so you're trying to discern what is the divine will for humans, concerning humans, and supernatural means, everything is in a sense, supernatural is reflecting the divine will. So the form of divination, the means of discernment can take a variety of forms here within divination. So we're going to look at some of those, partly just to get an appreciation, understanding for the broad ancient Near Eastern context, but then also to see how some of this is reflected in the Bible and where prophecy fits in relation to these. So prophecy kind of as a form of divination. But first of all, you have, this was a very common, what's called extispacy. Extispacy, this is when an animal was sacrificed, the organs of the animal, especially the liver, were set aside and for careful inspection. And any abnormalities that were found on that liver or whatever is being inspected was taken as an omen or portent for something that was predicted to be able to happen. This image right here, this was a teaching tool. This is an example. So this is a clay model of a liver. This one is, I believe, on display at, there's a link there for which museum where it's on display at. You notice across this liver, you have divided into these different sections, and then with a mark within each of those sections. So this was a teaching tool. So someone who is training in extispacy, as haruspex, someone who would practice this form of divination, they would examine the liver, and if they found a blemish that corresponded to the location on this teaching, model, then that would then relate to a certain prediction, something that they expected to happen. So if you have a blemish in this spot, it means this thing, or a blemish in this spot, it might mean the king is going to die, or a blemish in this spot might mean that the crops are going to fail, whatever the omen happens to be. This was one of the most common forms of divination in the ancient world. A lot of these clay models have been found. The way they would make these associations, because this just seems so foreign to us, partly they were made because something happened. So, for instance, the king did die, and then they would look and say, well, what animals, were sacrificed? Well, it so happens on the day that the king died, we found a liver that we were inspecting, and it had a blemish in this location. They would then take that as an omen. So if a blemish was found in that exact same location in the future, they would expect for the king to die, for instance. Or similar, It also seems like sometimes they were just, there was a bit of speculation, like what would happen if a blemish were found in this location. They didn't really know, but they would speculate on what they think that might look like. So extispacy was a very common, widely practiced form of divination. In Babylon, it seems especially, Babylon was really into this. And we see this reflected within the book of Daniel. And you have Daniel and all the other sages and wise, this was, a form of scholarship. There was a special training that went into being able to practice this form of divination. Then we also have astrology. Okay, so astrology, or you could say celestial divination. This is a form of divination. This is where you are observing and interpreting celestial movements. So whether it's anything in the sky, the moon, planets, stars, you watch, you observe, and you interpret those movements. So this is text here. This is from the State Archives of Assyria. So this is dating, I believe, to the 7th century, but it might be a little bit before then. The link is at the end, or the reference to it is at the end of this PowerPoint slide, so you can go track that down if you want. But the way this reads is, if Jupiter stands inside the moon, I really don't know exactly what that means, but here's what the prediction is. If Jupiter stands inside the moon, in this year, the king will die. Variant, there will be an eclipse of the moon and sun, a great king will die. If Jupiter enters the moon, there will be a famine in the westland. The king of Elam will fall in battle. In Subertu, a noble will revolt against his lord. If Jupiter enters the moon, the business of the land will diminish. If Jupiter comes out of the back of the moon, there will be hostility in the land. So these are all like astrological, predictive, divinatory texts saying, if these different events happen, and you can find tons of these. If you look through the ancient literature, this is just one example of how they would look at that and be able to, they would make predictions. They believed that the will of the gods for humans and, concerning all these issues was revealed, in this case, not by the liver of the sacrificed animal, but by the movements of planets and objects in the sky. Now, I think we can safely say extispacy and astrology would both fall under that prohibition of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. This is not something that should be practiced within ancient Israel. There is a small variation, though, when you come to, the observation and interpretation of celestial movements. Those weren't used by ancient Israel, or at least sanctioned within ancient Israel, to be used for making these sorts of predictions. What they said, though, was that you look at the stars, you look at the heavens, and rather it declares the glory of God. Very distinct difference between those. Okay? Next, moving on, another form of divination that we have within the Bible. This is actually a prominent and sanctioned form of divination. This was claromancy, or what's more commonly known as lot casting. So very prominent, used in a variety of contexts within the Old Testament and in the New Testament, whether it's the selection of the sacrificial goat on the Day of Atonement to identify guilty persons, dividing the land, or designating certain people for leadership, such as we see in the case with Saul, dividing plunder when appropriate, or even designating persons for service in the temple. All of these things, lot casting was practiced. Lot casting, here's an example. So this is a picture of is astrogalloi, or astragallos singular. These are a knuckle bone, or at least what I'm told. I don't really know my animal anatomy, but as I understand, these are like knuckle bones that were used. You would throw these like dice, and they kind of have that square shape to them, where you could throw them and you would be casting lots by doing so. It probably evolved. We don't know exactly what the lots look like for ancient Israel. Most people think that it probably was like a dice that had perhaps had two colors on it, and the idea was that it would be giving a yes or no answer. So you would ask a question, and it would be a yes or no answer. Like even if you wanted to select someone by lot, you would say, okay, I have 8 people in the room. And I would say, if it's this 4, let it be blue. If it's this 4, let it be red. Okay, it's blue. So now we're going to be this 4. Okay, so now we're going to divide them. If it's this 2, it's going to be blue. If it's this 2, it's going to be red. And then it's red. And say, okay, so now we have red. And now if it's this one, let it be blue. If it's this one, let it be red. And you roll it again. And that was understood, interpreted by the people to be God revealing his will for them. So that was lot casting, or claromancy. Okay. We also have, of course, dreams. Dreams were another form of divination, aneromancy. This was broadly practiced in the ancient Near East. Of course, we do see it prominent within the stories of Jacob. He has dreams of angels ascending, descending on a ladder. He also has a dream where God is telling Jacob to return to the land of his birth. Very significant. Joseph, we see this very prominently with him. He has a dreams of supremacy in Genesis 37. He interprets dreams for the cupbearer and the baker when he's in prison in Genesis 40, and then later even interprets Pharaoh's dream in Genesis 41. Similarly, Daniel kind of mirrors Joseph as a character in a number of different ways. Daniel prominently interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 4. But then Daniel is not only an interpreter of dreams, he becomes the dreamer himself. Daniel chapter 7, he has the dream of the 4 beasts. So those are pretty prominent. Sometimes dreams were used to speak falsely in Yahweh's name. So in Jeremiah 23, verse 25, we read, "I have heard what the prophets have said, who prophesy falsely in my name, saying, I had a dream, I had a dream." So there are some people who would prophesy falsely, claiming that they had a dream. Deuteronomy chapter 13, at the beginning of the chapter, verses 1 through 5, you can read, talks about a prophet or a dreamer of dreams who might encourage others to worship idols. So this was another form for God to reveal his will, sometimes would be practiced falsely. There is also the so-called Urim and Thumim. Okay, Urim and Thumim. This was an oracular device somewhat speculative concerning its precise nature. Okay, so we're not entirely certain. It was kept in the breastplate of the high priest. Now, it was different than lot casting, and really of one very significant way is that God could choose to not answer. So in the case of lot casting, you have two possible outcomes, the red or blue, if that's what it, who knows, a yes or a no. In other words, you ask a yes or no question, you cast the lots, and then you're given either a yes or a no answer. With the Urim and Thumim, we have this example in 1 Samuel chapter 28 that says that Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. He did not answer him by dreams or by the Urim, so the Urim and Thumim, or by the prophets. In other words, it wasn't lot casting where God, basically you always got a yes or no answer. This was something where God could choose not to answer. So very different in that sense. There was a study done by Cornelis van Dam on the Urim and Thumim. It's published by Eisenbrauns in 2015. And this is, to my knowledge, the most recent thorough examination of the Urim and Thumim. And he argues that they were a type of stone that would give a supernatural light. You would ask, you would consult the Urim and Thumim, and it was this type of stone that would supernaturally give off a light. So the word Urim means light or lights, and Thumim means perfection or perfections. These are both in plural, which is, we're not going to get into the Hebrew grammar of that, but maybe it could mean something like Urim and Thumim would be like the perfect light. That's what he argues for, and I'm kind of inclined to follow him. That's the best study that I know so far on that. So it's something that you consult, and either it glows as sort of a yes answer, or it just doesn't. And so God doesn't, God doesn't answer through that means. Okay? Now, prophecy is like broadly thinking about divination within the ancient world, especially looking at, as practiced within ancient Israel. Prophecy was, I believe, a form of intuitive divination. Okay, so at least since Cicero, divination has been categorized into two basic types. You have inductive. This requires a specialized knowledge, skill, and interpretation. This is the divination of a scholar. So Extispacy would be a perfect example. One studied to practice that form of divination. That wasn't something that you could just take anyone and say, hey, interpret this liver. You had to study. It was the work of a scholar. That was inductive. And then you had non-inductive or intuitive divination. This was the form of divination that was a direct revelation of the divine message to a recipient, the prophet himself. So Amos, he says, look, I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. In other words, he's saying, I'm not someone who studied and is a specialized scholar and skill in this. I haven't studied the star charts, the texts that talk about, if the moon does this or Jupiter does that, this is what it means. He says, God just speaks to me, basically. I just have received messages from God, and I'm relaying to you as I have received them. So prophecy falls within this category. The divine will in this case was not something that could be discerned by manipulating objects, forcing God. Like they couldn't force God to speak to them or reveal. It was just God's prerogative. God held that prerogative to reveal or to withhold the divine message. Okay, so prophecy is a form of divination which is broadly practiced in the ancient world. It is intuitive divination. All right, now looking at three primary roles of a prophet within the ancient world. The first role that I want to consider is the prophet as a messenger. Okay? Prophets frequently employed what we call the messenger formula. And this helps us to understand how they viewed their function within Israelite society. So the messenger formula would be, in Hebrew, ko amar, thus says, God, thus says the Lord, thus says whoever. This was the messenger formula. Thus says. So the messenger formula was used within oral communication in the ancient world. We see this in the ancient Near East more broadly. We do see examples within the Bible itself. So in Numbers chapter 22, verses 15 and 16, Balak, the king of Moab, and Balaam, he was a prophet. He was a non-Israelite prophet. We read of him. Then Balak sent representatives once again, more numerous and more distinguished than the previous. They came to Balaam and said to him, "This is what Balak, son of Zippor, says." So that's messenger formula. This is what, the person's name. This is what Balak, the son of Zippor, says, or ko amar, thus says. It's exactly the same. We see it in Judges. Jephthah is to the king of the Ammonites. He says, but Jephthah, and this is Judges 11, verses 14 and 15, Jephthah sent messengers once again to the king of the sons of Ammon and they said to him, "This is what Jephthah says," or "Thus says Jephthah." Ko amar Yiphthah. Also, there's other texts. You don't need to look all of them up. Just to appreciate that this is something that occurs even outside of prophetic texts. It occurs in the context of delivering an oral message from one person to another. We also see it in the broader ancient Near Eastern context. We see it in Ugaritic texts. There is the so-called messenger of the divine council. So when you say the divine council, now you're talking about the pantheon of gods within Ugaritic literature. Ugarit was a city that was north of Israel with texts dating to the early part of the second millennium. So it provides part of the broad background of the Canaanite society, culture, literature for ancient Israel. It's further to the north, but very significant. A lot of significant texts have been discovered there. And we read in one of those texts, Yam, the god of the sea and chaos, Yam sends two messengers. In the Ugaritic Databank 1, we read that. And, it just goes on from there, describing how these messengers have been sent out from Yam. So you have the divine council, and they make a decision. They want to enact something and do something, and then they send a messenger out to announce that will. The prophets, in a very similar way, are conceived as having stood not in the divine council of the Canaanite gods, but having stood in Yahweh's council, and then they are dispatched accordingly. That seems to be the sense that we have. Isaiah 6, here you have Isaiah. He's standing and, he is in the presence of God supernaturally there in the temple. He sees the King of Kings, and you know the story. Woe is me, for I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. He feels like his inadequacy. But then you hear, the Lord say, "Whom shall we send? Who will go for us?" This is Yahweh's divine counsel, and asking, who is it that we shall send? Talking to presumably angels who were in attendance there with him. And Isaiah, of course, he takes that commission. He says, "Here I am, send me." Similarly, in Jeremiah 23, verse 18, we read, "But who has stood in the counsel of the Lord? that he should see and hear his word? Who has paid attention to his word and listened? The presumed answer, of course, is the prophet. The prophet is the one who has stood in the council, and the prophet is the one who has paid attention to his word, listened, and is now being sent to deliver. So when a prophet announces, "Thus says the Lord," you really have to embrace this idea. This is just like a messenger sent from a king to speak to one of their generals. I mean, the words that messenger conveys is not their own. This is not like, well, let me tell you how I see things. It's really, this is the message of the king to you, and you need to receive these as though they're coming from the king. When a prophet similarly said, "Thus says the Lord," what they're saying is, this is not Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Zephaniah's best thoughts concerning the situation. This is not their estimation, their sizing up of things. What they're saying is, I have been in the presence of Yahweh, and I have heard him speak, and now I am relaying to you exactly what he spoke to me. Okay? That's the idea. Now, as inspired scripture, the best way to take this is that God uses their own personality and style, and in the style of the prophecy, the style of their writing. We do certainly see that, but the idea is that the message originates from Yahweh. Okay, so that's the first of the roles of the prophets that we see. The second is the prophet as a covenant mediator. Now, if this is getting a little long, again, I encourage you, take a break, pause the video, come back. So covenants within the ancient Near East, they were widely used across the ancient Near East. So they were a form of treaty. So between two parties, kings of nations would enter into covenant with one another. There are other ones. We have covenants between individuals. We see that in the Bible, like between David and Jonathan, etc. But what we're talking about specifically is covenant treaties that were between two kings of different nations. There was practiced by a variety of cultures across time. The type that is most beneficial for studying the Bible are the covenant treaties of the second millennium from the Hittites. These are sometimes called suzerainty covenants. The word suzerainty just means a suzerain as a great king. So it's a covenant between a great king and his vassal. And just like prophetic speech followed predictable forms and patterns, and you can study those, covenants also followed predictable forms and patterns. The classic study in this is a couple of articles that was done by George Mendenhall, I believe in the 1950s. You can look those up pretty easily. I'll put a link for them, so if you want to look at those, you can. And he examines the different structure. I'm not going to go over all of that here in this lecture. Just want to highlight a couple points because this relates to the role of the prophet, how they conceive their role within the society of ancient Israel. The emphasis of these treaty documents, though, these covenant treaties, was that it was based on a relationship between two kings. So when we talk about treaties today tend to be very impersonal. For them, it was actually much more of a personal thing. It was between two individuals. There were a series of stipulations given within the covenant. This was one of the main elements. These are the laws. The heart, though, of all stipulations was exclusive loyalty to the suzerain, the great king. The vassal, the heart of all the laws, everything that they're supposed to do, the heart of it is you are only loyal to your suzerain, to the one whom you are in covenant with. If you go form a treaty, like if you are in a treaty with the Assyrians, and then you go and you try to make a treaty with Egypt, that would be like the ultimate transgression. Similarly, for Israel, if they are in this covenant relationship with Yahweh and they go and they try to form a new sort of loyalty to another god, Baal, or even to another nation, Egypt, well, that is the ultimate transgression. So when Jesus was asked, what's the most important law? He summarized it in two. And the first one that he said is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. It is that you shall love God. It's God alone. And even the beginning of the 10 Commandments and the Decalogue. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, that's the heart of what stipulations were and the laws were. Also, you had the witnesses of the covenant. So this has been mentioned before in the ancient Near East. In covenants, witnesses were the pantheon of all the gods. All the gods were called upon to witness the covenant. In the Mosaic covenant, the covenant between God and his people mediated by Moses, the witnesses were God himself, sometimes called as witness. The people were sometimes called as witnesses. Then very significantly, creation itself was called as a witness. So this is a significant element. The creation remembers and witnessed the covenant, this forming of this relationship between God and his people Israel. And then, of course, you have the sanctions. Sanctions are both the blessings and the curses of the covenant based on loyalty to the stipulations. We see this in the ancient Near Eastern covenants. When one king would enter into a covenant with another, the suzerain would promise all kinds of blessings if the vassal was loyal, and all kinds of curses if they were not. And similarly, you read in Leviticus chapter 26 or in Deuteronomy chapter 28. At the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 28, we read, "It shall be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I am commanding you today, that the Lord your God will put you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come to you and reach you if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed will you be in the city, and blessed will you be in the country. Blessed will be the children of your womb, the produce of your ground," etc. It just goes on from there. A number of significant blessings if you obey the stipulations of the covenant. But if you scroll down in verse 15, there's a transition. "But it shall come about, if you do not obey the Lord your God, to be careful to follow all his commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed will you be in the city, and cursed will you be in the country. Cursed will be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed will be the children of your womb, the produce of your ground," etc. And it just goes on from there. And you hear that kind of reversal of language that's taking place. So prophets, they understood the covenant. They understood that there was this covenant relationship, and that if Israel was obedient to the covenant, following the stipulations as comes from God, and that primary one, exclusive loyalty to God and God alone, that if they followed that, they would be blessed. But if they didn't, they would be cursed, and there would be sanctions. And so the prophets announced sanctions of the covenant, the curses to the people, based on their infidelity to the stipulations, as, of course, inspired by God. Okay, so prophet as messenger, sent from God to announce his message. Prophet as covenant mediator, announcing the sanctions, announcing transgression of the covenant and sanctions against the people, the curses of the covenant for breaking that covenant. And then we have the prophet as royal propagandist. Okay, so prophet as royal propagandist. Now, kingship in the ancient world was understood to be something that was divinely commissioned. It was a divinely commissioned mandate to rule, to reign as king. We see this reflected. Hammurabi, the famous Hammurabi of the second millennium, early second millennium, and the law code of Hammurabi. We read of him, it says, when the god Shamash, this is the god of the sun, when the god Shamash, great lord of heaven and earth, king of the gods, with his shining face, joyfully looked at me, Hammurabi, the prince, his favorite, granted to me everlasting kingship and a reign of long days. So he conceived his kingship was something granted to him by the gods, granted him this everlasting kingship. Even closer to the time of Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar, he also says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the loyal shepherd, the one permanently selected by Marduk. Marduk was the chief god of Babylon. The exalted ruler, the one beloved by Nabu. Nebuchadnezzar, the name is derived from the name of the god Nabu. The wise expert who is attentive to the ways of the gods, the tireless governor, the caretaker of Esagil and Azida, the foremost heir of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. He goes on from there. So he's saying, I've been selected to rule by Marduk, by Nabu. Yeah, there's some other text. I don't need to read it anymore. You get the idea. They understood kingship was this divinely commissioned mandate to rule. Even within the Mari letters, which hopefully you've taken the time to read through the selection that I gave you of those. In a Mari letter to the king Zimri-Li, we read of a letter of a prophet that says, "Speak to my lord Zimri-Lim. Thus says Nursin, your servant. Abaya, the Apilum prophet of Adu, the lord of Aleppo, came to me and said, Thus says Adu, I gave all the lands to Yadun-Lim because of my weapons. He had no rival. He abandoned me. However, so I gave to Shamshi-Adad the land that I had previously given to him. As for Shamshi-Adad, yada, 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 and then it says, I restored you, I returned you to the throne of the house of your father." So this is the God speaking to Zimri-Lim. He says, I returned you to the throne of the house of your father. I gave you the weapons that I used to combat the sea. I anointed you with the oil of my resplendence. Now no one will stand before you. Okay? So kingship is this divinely commissioned mandate. So kings would often then consult the prophets, as the prophets were messengers sent by the gods. They had, they had this intuitive divination. They were, intuitively receiving God's message. Kings would then, understanding themselves as commissioned by the gods, would seek the counsel of the prophets. So the Israelite, or the Judah, the king of Judah, King Jehoshaphat, requests of King Ahab of Israel to inquire of a prophet before they were to go into battle against Aram. He said, we need, the wisdom, the advice. They would seek that sort of counsel. Ahab has 400 prophets employed, but unfortunately for him, they're not prophets of Yahweh. They're actually prophets of Baal, and you can read that in 1 Kings 18. Jehoshaphat, he requests. Oh, sorry, I already mentioned that. Jehoshaphat requests Ahab to consult a prophet of Yahweh. Now, some prophets were actually even kept on stipend from the king. So there's Gad, who is called the king's seer in 2 Samuel 24:11. Nathan, whom we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when David has this desire to build a temple, Nathan seems to be like a prophet on stipend from the king. Now, there is a tension, though, that does arise because you have some prophets that are considered free prophets in contrast to, the royal prophets. like Gad, the king seer. So you had a prophet who was like employed by the king, and then you had prophets that were free, so to speak. So Elijah would have been one of those. Ahab had his 400 prophets of Baal. Elijah would have been a free prophet. He wasn't part of the Ahab's 400 plus prophets who were under his employ, and there was tension between them. In the book of Jeremiah, we, if you remember in talking about the forms of prophetic speech, we looked at the false prophecy of Hananiah. Hananiah seemed to have been a royal prophet. He was employed to, sort of give this royal propaganda to support the king, his policies, to prophesy on his behalf. And here you had Jeremiah, who was a free prophet, who said, no, God hasn't sent you because you're saying things that are false. Amos chapter 7 verses 10 through 17. Again, we have that Amos says, I am not a prophet or a son of a prophet. In other words, he's saying, I'm not a court prophet. And he describes, I'm a grower of sycamore figs, or he's a sheep manager. He's like a professional farmer, like probably doing some itinerant work, agricultural work. And God then chose to speak to him, through that intuitive divination. He wasn't trained in this, so to speak. So you see these clashes. Of course, one of the biggest clashes that we have that I already kind of alluded to is Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And then, of course, the clashes between Jeremiah and Hananiah. Okay? So we've covered a lot in this lecture as well. We talked about prophecy as a form of divination, helping to understand prophecy within that broader context, and then looked at these three roles of a prophet: the prophet as a messenger, the prophet as a covenant mediator, and then the prophet as a royal propagandist. Okay, and there are the endnotes if you want to look at the texts that I discussed. These are just the texts that were specifically in the PowerPoint. They were not the texts that I read from that were in my notes. So just so you're clear on what's available to you there. Thank you.